Welcome and thank you for joining the Jar of Manna Bible Podcast. This is your host, Alfred Martinez. And if you're new, I welcome you. Thank you for finding this channel. And I'm hoping that you like studying the scriptures. Maybe you're new at the scriptures. Maybe you are a learner in the past and just want to hear what I got to say. Well, I've been working through the book of Exodus, and we're going through the book of Exodus from chapter 1 all the way to chapter 40. And this episode is going to be the second half of chapter 12. I like to do one chapter per video session, but chapter 12 is so in depth and has so much information that I decided to break this up into two parts. So part one was my previous video, and you can see that and find that in the channel. And I went through verse 1 through verse 28. So I went through verse 1 through all the way to verse 28. And today we're going to pick it up on verse 29, and we're going to carry that to the end of the chapter, which is 51. So this chapter has 51 verses. It's quite a bit. So I felt it would be best to break it up. So here we are. We're in part 2 of the Passover, which is the heart and soul of the book of Exodus. It's also what the ministry of Jesus, Yeshua, what his ministry was about, that he would be the Passover lamb, that he would come to be the sacrifice that the people needed. And, I'm trying to put together these points that why is he the Passover lamb? Why is it so important? Why was the Passover important in the time of Moses? And why is it important for us now? And if you saw my first video, I try to put those parallels together. I'm going to continue, and we're going to see the 10th plague. We've been working through the plagues, and then we're also going to see the Exodus, when they actually do leave the land of Egypt that we've been reading about this whole time. And then also at the end of the chapter, you'll have the Passover regulations, and we'll go through that and try and sum it up in a timely manner. So with that, thank you again for joining us, and I'm going to go ahead and get started. So if you have your scriptures with you and you'd like to follow along, I'm going to be reading from the New King James Version. And you can see my screen. I'll switch over shortly, and then we can just read this together, bring it back up to the top, verse 29, and then go through. And I have a few verses that I'd like to speak about, and hopefully I can bring a little bit more in-depth teaching that you may or you may not have ever heard before. So with that, let me go ahead and share my screen, and we'll get started. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start reading. If you can see my screen, this is Exodus 12. We're going to read from 29 and go down to the end of the chapter. And when I'm done reading, we'll go ahead and just pinpoint a few little verses that I wanted to share with you. And hopefully we'll learn something new. So starting on verse 29, then it came to pass at midnight that the Lord Yahweh struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of livestock. So Pharaoh rose in the night, he, all his servants, and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. Then he called for Moses and Aaron by night and said, "Rise, go out from among my people, both you and your children of Israel, and go, serve the Lord as you have said. Also take your flocks and your herds, as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also." And the Egyptians urged the people that they might send them out of the land in haste, for they said, "We shall all be dead." So the people took their dough before it was leavened, having their kneading bowls bound up in their clothes and on their shoulders. Now the children of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, and they asked from the Egyptians articles of silver, articles of gold, and clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they granted them what they requested. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. Then the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides children. A mixed multitude went up with them also, and flocks and herds, and a great deal of livestock. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough which they had brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were driven out of Egypt and could not wait, nor had they prepared provisions for themselves. Now, the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years. And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, on that very same day, it came to pass that all the armies of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It is a night of solemn observance to the Lord Yahweh for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. This is that night of the Lord Yahweh, a solemn observance for all the children of Israel throughout their generations. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, this is the ordinance of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat it, but every man's servant who is bought for money, when you have circumcised him, then he may eat it. A sojourner and a hired servant shall not eat it. In one house it shall be eaten. You shall not carry any of the flesh outside the house, nor shall you break one of its bones. All the congregation of Israel shall keep it. And when a stranger dwells with you and wants to keep the Passover to the Lord Yahweh, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near and keep it. And he shall be as a native of the land. For no uncircumcised person shall eat it. One law shall be for the native born and for the stranger who dwells among you. Thus all the children of Israel did, and the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. So they did. And it came to pass on that very same night. Thus all the children of Israel did, as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. So they did. And it came to pass on that very same day that the Lord Yahweh brought the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt, according to their armies. Okay, so there you have it. There's Exodus chapter 12 from 29 to 51. And there's quite a bit to cover in this area, in this section. So I'm just going to go ahead and pick out a few verses that stood out to me. I mean, really, I could probably spend hours and hours on this chapter, but I'm going to go ahead and keep it at a minimum. I wanted to take you back to the verses, and we'll start on like about verse 32. There's an interesting quote that is quoted from Pharaoh to Moses and Aaron at the time they're leaving, and this kind of is a summation of a sense of what we've seen from Pharaoh over the last previous chapters. And I'll take you there right now. And what is really astonishing to me is that Pharaoh is actually asking for a blessing on the way out. When the children of Israel are leaving, he has a request, and we'll read that. So verse 32, after the firstborn is dead, you have this plagues, all the 10 plagues that have been accumulating from all the chapters that we've been reading. The plagues get worse and worse, and this final plague is the death of the firstborn. And we see that it is all the way from Pharaoh, who sat on the throne. So you have the highest man in authority, who is no better than the man that's a criminal in the dungeon, because it says for even the captive that was in the dungeon, even his firstborn would be at risk. And so that's what happens. So there's the death of the firstborn, and even the livestock, not just people. So this happens to Pharaoh. And it actually says in verse 30 that there was not a house where there was not one dead. So we get to verse 32. It says here, also take your flocks and your herds, as you have said, and be gone and bless me also. So what's interesting is that you have the Egyptians had been for 3 days and nights kept in anxiety and in horror by the darkness, right? Because that was the plagues that were just before this. And now the rest is broken by far more and terrible calamity. This is the worst of all of the plagues. And the plague struck their firstborn and the families that were within Egypt. So we see that the destroying angel entered every dwelling here in Egypt, all of Egypt, that was not marked with blood. And you have to go back earlier to the chapter. That blood marking on your doorposts and your lintels is what would prevent the destroying angel to come in and take your firstborn. So if you had this blood marked on your doorpost, then the judging I mean, the death angel would pass over the judgment that was upon all of Egypt. So he would pass over you. And now we get to the Exodus, or and so before we get to the Exodus, we see one last cry from Pharaoh. He says that to verse 32, take your flocks, your herds, as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also. So you see this little petition, actually a huge petition from Pharaoh. His people have died, and he is asking, go ahead and go. He's telling Moses and Aaron, you can go take your flocks, but will you please bless me? And it's just striking to me that the submission of Pharaoh at this moment, it finally took 10 plagues to finally get him to this breaking point. But he said that in the past. We've read that in the past, that he's seems to be repentant, but yet he isn't. And so we'll see if he really is at this moment as we get into the next chapter. So we get to verse 34, and it says, so the people took their dough before it was leavened, having their kneading bowls bound up in their clothes and on their shoulders. So we read that as they were leaving in haste, and that's mentioned earlier in the chapter. Must have been a custom that people were baking their bread, maybe like a sourdough. If you've ever done like a sourdough, you have this yeast, which is your leaven, and you got to put it in your flour and water. But there is a certain element of time that you have to wait for your yeast to ferment, and it doesn't seem like this whole means of making your bread, they didn't have the time to do that, so they had to just take their dough without the leaven and their bowls and whatnot and just head out because they were in haste. This was all took place pretty quickly, and we learn later that they verse 39, and they baked unleavened cakes of the dough which they had brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were driven out of Egypt and could not wait. So we see how they what happened. So they ended up baking their dough, but it was unleavened cakes, also known as matzah, and that's how we get this festival of unleavened bread. We'll learn that in the next chapter, and it's one of the God's Yahweh's holy set apart festivals, is the festival of unleavened bread, and it's because of this situation. There is no time, and it's for us to remember what God had Yahweh God had done to these people. And so let's go ahead and move on to verse 35. Now the children of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, and they had asked from the Egyptians articles of silver, articles of gold, and clothing. And we see this in the previous chapters, right? We see that there was already foretold that they would take their that they would have provisions, that God would give them favor to take what the articles of silver and gold and clothing, and it goes all the way back to Exodus 3. And I will grant this people such a favor in the sight of the Egyptians that when you leave, you will not go empty-handed. And then Exodus chapter 11. Now I will announce to the people that the men and the women alike should ask their neighbors for articles of gold and silver. So this was mentioned several times over in the past, and now here we are, and this is exactly what's going to happen. God has made provision that they wouldn't leave Egypt empty-handed, so they do go with articles of silver, gold, and clothing. Now, the next verse I want to go ahead and talk about is verse 38. A mixed multitude went up with them also, and flocks and herds, and a great deal of livestock. So what we have here is, not only do the Hebrews leave and follow the commands of Yahweh to go to the wilderness, or go into the land that they're promised, also we do see a mixed multitude, which is the meaning behind this, is that you also have Egyptians leaving at the same time. We see that this mixed multitude of non-Hebrews are coming with them. Maybe because they've realized what their lives have been through over the time, or what maybe they realize we better follow them. This is going to be a better place. But we read about this mixed multitude in Numbers chapter 11. It kind of gets brought up again, and it actually does say mixed multitude. Now in Numbers chapter 11, this is later on down the road once they're already in the wilderness. It says, now the mixed multitude who were among them yielded to intense craving, so the children of Israel also wept again and again, and said, who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish which we ate freely in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, and the onions, and the garlic. But now our whole being is dried up. There is nothing all except this manna before our eyes. So this is the mixed multitude later down the road, probably years, I'm not really exactly sure, crying out because they would rather be back where they were in Egypt. So it's just interesting that it's this group of people that did leave with the Hebrews, and they seem to be wanting to have freedom, but as time goes on, they would rather be bondage to their Pharaoh. But let's move on. Verse 39, and here's what I mentioned earlier. They baked unleavened cakes. And so that is that's what they ended up using. That's what they ended up baking with the unleavened dough that they had. They baked unleavened cakes because they didn't have time. They didn't have time to wait for their bread to rise or their sourdough, so to speak, or whatnot. They just left, and they ended up baking without the yeast. So that's what verse 39 is talking about. Let's see. How about we go to verse 42? It is a night of solemn observance to the Lord for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. This is that night of the Lord, a solemn observance for all the children of Israel throughout their generations. A remembrance of what this whole night is all about. It's a solemn observance because there's a lot going on here. There's joy, right? Because Yahweh is finally taking them out of this land that they've been oppressed in and slaved over for 400 and something years. So there's joy in that, and that they're going to be free people. But it's also solemn because there was a lot that perished at this moment, right? I mean, it says that every home there was one that wasn't dead. Those, the homes that didn't have the Passover blood on it. So there's that solemn observance. I mean, it was a sad night at the same time that there was joy. It was solemn and joyous. And this is something that we should remember. It tells us that it should be throughout their generations, the children of Israel. And, when I want to touch this subject because we're supposed to be following Jesus, Yeshua, who is our Redeemer, our Savior, our Shepherd, our foundation where we rest. He's our Rabbi, our teacher, and so we should be doing what he does. And he says that in his commands in the Gospels, that he says to follow me, and if you love me, you would keep my commandments. And his commandments are not burdensome. And there's several verses, many verses, but I want to take you to just a little nugget that shows what did Jesus do, right? I mean, what did he do? And we should be just like him. So in Luke, the Gospel of Luke, we see that in verse 41, his parents, Jesus' mother and father, went to Jerusalem every year at the Feast of Passover, right? Isn't that what Jesus did? He celebrated the Feast of Passover. His mother and father did, who were known as righteous. Joseph was known as a righteous man, and Mary was as well, favored by the Lord. They obey the commandments of God. Jesus obeys perfectly. And so if we follow Jesus, I can see why God says this is something that we should be remembering forever, for all generations. It's the Lord's feast, right? It's not some made up holiday. It's the Lord's holiday. And we go to Leviticus chapter 23, and this is the chapter that describes all of the Lord's holidays, holy days. And verse 4 through 8 talks about the Passover and then unleavened bread. And verse 4, these are the feasts of the Lord, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim at your appointed times. And here on the 14th day of the month, of the first month at twilight, is the Lord's Passover. Again, this is the Yahweh's Passover. This is commonly known as the Jews' holy holiday, but it actually doesn't say that. It says it's the Lord's holy day. And I think it's something that should be remembered, something that should be kept. Observe it in your best capacity that you can. Read the scriptures on your own time. Read chapter 12, go through it, read what they ate, and remember this solemn night of remembrance. It should be holy through all of your generations. Teach it to your children and learn about this day. It's called the Passover. It's the Feast of First Fruits. It's the unleavened bread. It's all summarized in this certain time where it's very important. It's a very important holy days to learn and to know. And Deuteronomy, I'm going to go to chapter 16, and this is verse 1, mentioned once again, to observe the month of Abib and keep the Passover to Yahweh your God. For in the month of Abib, the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt by night. You see that in the scriptures. You see Jesus celebrating Passover. And I talked about it in my last video. You see that Paul writes about keeping the feast in 1 Corinthians. He talks about keeping the feast, that we should keep this feast. And I agree with it. I agree with the scriptures that we should be keeping this feast. So let me go ahead and continue in verse Exodus, back to Exodus 12. And we're going to go to verse towards the end of the book, end of the chapter, I'm sorry, verse 43. And this is where we get into the Passover regulations. Verse 43 and verse 44 says, and the Lord Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, this is the observance of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat it, but every man's servant who is bought for money, when you have circumcised him, he may eat it. So think about this. If you're a believer in the scriptures and you know that Jesus is your savior and he's your redeemer, think about what this says. Every man's servant who is bought for money, he shall eat it. He shall eat the Passover, right? Let's go to 1 Corinthians. It says, before I get there, think about this. For every man's servant who is bought, right? Okay. So I'm going to go to 1 Corinthians, which is the New Testament, which is Paul the Apostle, talks about this actual subject. 1 Corinthians 7, verse 23, he says that you were bought at a price, but do not become slaves of men. Do you see that? Back in Exodus 12 that I just read, Exodus 12:44, it says, but every man's servant who was bought, right? And this says you were bought at a price. So if you can understand that Jesus or Yeshua bought you with his blood, he bought you at a price. So therefore you are servant to Christ. You're a servant to Messiah, not slaves to men. So therefore you've been bought and you're his, right? You serve him, you obey him, you follow after him, you walk in his ways. So when you realize that you've been bought, then this hopefully makes sense when it says here that, but every man, the Christ, right? The Christ, man, Jesus, whoever his servant, you, me, who is bought. This says bought for money, right? And you've been circumcised. Is your heart circumcised, right? We can go through all this, but you're qualified to eat this. Does that make sense? And you should observe this Passover. And that's what Paul is trying to refer us to, that you've been bought with a price. He's bringing us back to this subject. So therefore, the Passover is for you. You celebrate it. You read about it. You observe it. You learn it. Teach it to your children. Teach it to your children's children, so that we don't forget what Yahweh had done for you. And he bought you with the price through his son Jesus, and what God Yahweh did to the Hebrews when they were, there was a price to pay, but you can be passed over. There's a price for us to pay, but we can be passed over when we're bought, and we now are servants to Jesus. Now, I also want to take you to, along this same subject, Matthew chapter 6, verses 24. No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate one and love the other, or else be loyal to one and despise the other. You cannot serve Yahweh, God, and Mammon. So there's that servant subject again. If you were bought with a price, you can only serve one master. And we need to learn what that means and how to serve one master. And it may take time to understand that, wrap our mind around this, but that's what we should be striving for. If we're serving another master, we need to despise that other and just love on the one that bought us with a price, which is Jesus, the Messiah, has bought us with his blood. That's the price that he paid for you. And it is up to us to pursue his righteousness and to pursue the kingdom of God by doing things that are God's ways, not man's ways. So let's go back to Exodus. The last verse I think I want to talk about is verse 49, and then we can get ready to come to a conclusion. Verse 49 says that one law shall be for the native born and for the stranger who dwells among you. Right? So this law that we're talking about, which is the Passover, but it also encompasses all of God's law, because once you start reading it, we understand that all of God's law fall under the umbrella. Every little law falls under the umbrella of his whole overarching law, which is God's commandments, God's laws, his instructions. I like to more say God's law, because when you do his law, you have blessings. And then when you don't do his laws, there comes consequences. So what this is saying is one law shall be for the native born, which is those Hebrews, right? But also for the stranger who dwells among as well. So we saw this mixed multitude who were not Hebrews, but they wanted to be a part of the family of the Hebrews, right? They wanted to be part of God's family. So if you are actually as if you were one body, right? It's the same, and we see this in when we read something like this. And I'm gonna take you back to the New Testament, or in the book of Galatians, chapter 3, verse 28. It sums up what we just read in Leviticus. Whether you're native born or you're a stranger, but when you come together and you want to follow after Yahweh and his son, the Messiah, when you want to follow after him, then we're one. We're not, the law is for both. It's not for, oh, this is the law for the Jews or for these people, but we have something different. No, we're the same. And Paul knew this, because he mentions this in Galatians 3. He says, for you are all sons of God through faith in Christ Messiah, right? For as many of you as were baptized unto Messiah have put on Messiah. There is neither a Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male or female. You are all in Messiah Jesus. So what is Paul is saying here is exactly what Exodus is saying, that this law, God's law, is good for you. It's good for us. And it's not just for a certain group of people. It's for everybody that wants to come in and follow. And that's what Paul is mentioning. There's other verses that Paul mentions this too as well, that he's bringing the law, that it's good, it's holy, And, Jesus said the same thing, that if you love me, you would keep my commandments. And then he also said, my commandments are not burdensome. He has a yoke that is easy. Man's yoke is hard. And so that's just that conclusion, right? This last segment with us in Matthew, this is the words of Messiah, Matthew chapter 5, famous sermon, right? Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, verse 19. He says here, whoever therefore breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches men so shall be called least of the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does and teaches them shall be called the great. Now, Messiah Jesus was talking about a lot of subjects in this sermon, but he does talk about God's law as a whole, because he said not one jot or tittle would fall away from the law. And so this Passover is part of God's law. We should know how to, or want to know how to do this, right? You want to know how to do his holy days. He's already created them. We don't need to make anything new. He already has them there for us. And I think that's what this Passover's passage is teaching us. Just read it on your own several times. Chapter 12, over and over, and learn from it, meditate on it, that you would be inspired to, or challenge or encouraged to learn God's in Yahweh's Passover, that he passed over the Hebrews. He can pass over you on your day when we see him, that you are covered in the blood of Christ, that he is your doorpost, right? That he is the one that shed the blood for you, because you and I need a lamb. We need a lamb so that we can be passed over. And the only lamb that is sufficient at this moment would be the Lamb of God, the one who takes away the sins of the world. And that lamb is going to be Jesus Messiah. So we need to have him as our lamb, because God has provided the lamb for us, and he's the Passover lamb. So the Passover is very important for us to understand and to know. And I would encourage you not to be afraid of the Passover. Read it and just learn from it, and do it. It's a blessing to keep the Passover. Once you learn it, you'll learn that it is Yahweh's days, not the Jews' days, not a man's days. Nobody made this up except the Creator who created us. And he created us to follow after his son, the Messiah. So with that, I'm going to conclude on chapter 12. I love chapter 12. It's a wonderful passage. And then 13 and 14 and so on we're going to learn about them traveling, getting into the wilderness, and start learning and observing God's commandments. They've been pulled out. Now it's time for them to learn new things. And that's what we're doing here. We're reading through these chapters and we're learning new things. So thank you for joining us. I hope you've been blessed by reading part 1 and part 2 of the Passover. And I hope to see you soon. God bless and good night.